gone really quiet. You're all very obedient. So, welcome back, everyone. So, our next speaker is Roger Kline, OBE. Is a research fellow at Middlesex University Business School. Roger has authored several reports on race equality in the NHS, including the snowy white peaks of the NHS, No More Tick Boxes, and Too Hot to Handle, which was recently published on lessons for the NHS from recent tribunal cases on race discrimination. He is designed the NHS workforce race equality standard, which we all know, the RES, and was joint national director of the RES team between 2015 and 17, and voted as one of the top 30 most influential UK HR thinkers by HR Magazine. So really proud to welcome the Roger Kline. He said he's going to embarrass me, so I'll get it in first. So welcome, Roger, and it's great to have you as part of the conference today.
You haven't heard what I'm going to say yet. Can you hear me? Can you hear me at the back? Yeah? I've got a note here that says speak into the mic. So if you can't hear me because I wander around, just wave. Okay. Thank you. And I should say these are the prettiest slides I've ever done, because when they were sent, they came back all kind of nice pictures and things, on which my slides are never like. So thank you. So I hope what I say will kind of complement what Yinka's touched on. So I am a white man. I'm a man. I'm fairly old. I was born in the same year the NHS was founded. And that's given me, throughout my life, all sorts of advantages in terms of interviews, compared particularly to women, because of the assumptions that people make, both about me and not about me. I've never ever been to an interview panel that didn't have at least one white man on it. I don't have to worry about whether or not, at what point to talk to white people. Don't have to worry about talking about their children and racism at primary school. I've never been asked, or as far as I know, people even thought about, if I have children, is that a problem being appointed? In fact, when men talk about having children in interviews, it's usually seen as a sign of what a lovely rounded person they are, rather than are they going to have time off when they're ill. So that's quite important, I think, in terms of as an ally, because although I'm going to primarily talk about allyship in terms of bullying, harassment and discrimination, particularly race discrimination, it doesn't just apply to race, although race is the issue we find hardest to talk about. So I'm going to talk about allyship, but before I get to what you I hope will do, and hopefully many of you already are doing, I think it's really important to understand the evidence base that says that allyship is important. It's not about compliance, it's about improvement, or at least it's not primarily about compliance, it's about improvement. If you do these things, it will make for a better organisation, better patient care, and indeed better for staff. So I'll talk about the evidence base, which draws on inclusion, psychological safety, civility, compassion. I'm going to talk about that because although the government's just given the NHS finally a fair chunk of money, it hasn't really addressed the fact that there are not enough staff in the health service. So how we treat staff, how we keep staff, how we get the best out of staff, how we treat all staff, including yourselves, with respect is really important. And allyship, of course, is also, it's not just kind of, if you like, a business case. It's part of the shared humanity that we all have, both amongst ourselves here and amongst all those who we work with or provide services to. So it is about good intentions, but it's not just about good intentions. There's no point really in having good intentions unless you also know what to do and why you're doing it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. You have the first slide. Try and make sure I don't cause chaos here. And these slides are going to be shared once I've tidied up one or two typos in them. So there's a wealth of evidence here. I'm not going to dwell on it, but discrimination, particularly race discrimination, though recently sexual harassment has finally surfaced in the health service after years of being under the radar. Discrimination generally, bad for staff, bad for organizational effectiveness, bad for the quality and safety of patient care. And then I've run through the kind of some of the evidence that if you have discrimination and bullying in organizations, it disrupts teamwork, undermines innovation. I put all the links here, so if any of you want to follow any of it up, you can do. Diverse leadership leads to better outcomes, including better financial outcomes, as long as the diversity is underpinned by inclusion. Psychologically safe work environments where people feel they are treated with dignity and respect can achieve more effective, safer patient care. And race discrimination deters staff from raising concerns, admitting mistakes, and being as effective as they could be in teams. And there's lots of evidence about all those statements. And just to continue briefly in the same vein, there's a cost to health and well-being, work of James Nasru, various others, in great detail and very convincingly explains that. There are substantial financial costs where myself and Duncan Lewis, because we couldn't find the number anywhere, we worked out an approximate cost, which was accepted by the minister at the time, that at the very least, bullying in the health service cost of staff, not the impact on patient care, cost at least £2.3 billion a year. So if there's your finance director's in the room, NHS England very kindly on the back of that worked out a calculator. If these are your levels of bullying, this is roughly what the cost is to your organisation each year. So it cuts there's a financial cost. There's other costs as well in terms of absenteeism, presenteeism, turnover, and so on. There's an impact on patient access, care, safety, reputation, impacts on recruitment, discretionary effort, and career progression. I'll talk a little bit maybe about career progression later. And particularly in terms of international staff, there's increasing evidence that they may be more vulnerable and less willing to speak out. We saw some of that during COVID. So there's a whole, I've only put those up, not to convince you, because I suspect you know all that, but there's a strong evidence base. It's not just your hunch. There's a strong evidence base about the impact of poor behaviours. And there's an equally strong evidence base about the benefit of good behaviours. So, and I've just, there's a wealth of this stuff. So, Western Co show that supportive, respectful environments enhance patient outcomes. Compassionate leadership, I'll talk a little bit about compassion in a moment, reduces errors, injuries, absenteeism, and mortality. Crucially for allyship, relational intelligence is as important as rational intelligence. If you want to build an effective team, it's not enough to just be able to interpret the graphs and work out from that how do you relate to people, how do you listen to people, how do you kind of work better with them, support them, and where necessary challenge them in kind of civil ways. And inclusive and compassionate leadership help to create a psychologically safe workplace. So if you think of inclusion and psychological safety as a Venn diagram with a very substantial overlap, they're not the same, but they greatly overlap. Psychology. Actually, have any of you read a report on something called Project Aristotle that Google did? Well, if I may cheekily suggest you read it. It's a wonderful, short piece of work. Google wanted to know, it's about 5-6 years ago, why are some of their teams much more effective, much better retention, much more innovative than other teams. And their working hypothesis was it's because it has the best people in it, whatever best means. And they discovered it wasn't. What they discovered was the best teams were the ones where people felt it's safe to challenge, safe to ask questions, safe to admit mistakes, and to collaborate effectively together. Those were the most effective teams with the least turnover and the most productivity. And in the case of Google, also, they were far and away the most profitable team. So there's a good evidence base for this stuff. There's lots of other things that I've listed. Some of it there, one or two of you may have come across Amy Edmondson's stuff. It's very good. If you haven't, it's worth having a look at. The Google thing, by the way, is a free, almost all of these things are free online. And collaboration and communication, the Joint Commission in the States found, was the failure to collaborate and communicate was by far the single biggest cause of unsafe situations and safety mistakes. And finally, compassion. I put up there a book called Compassionomics. You're going to think I'm a bookseller. It is a fantastic book written by two very senior American doctors who provide the evidence base that compassion isn't just a nice, good thing, but it makes for better organizations, better healthcare. And I've sort of summarized some of the things here. Improves patient outcomes, staff well-being, fewer readmissions, better patient satisfaction, quicker recovery, large improvements in service user depression, anxiety, etc. It's not just about psychological impact, but it's if you like, it's the kind of more general clinical impact of compassionate behaviors. Compassion being, if you like, operationalizing kindness. So compassion, inclusion, psychological safety, if you think of those as the antithesis to poor behaviors, to me, that's the evidence base that needs to underpin allyship. And without it, we'll struggle to move it beyond being good intentions. Linked to that, we have struggled historically in the NHS to be open and to encourage people to raise concerns and admit mistakes and so on. And that's particularly true of bullying and all forms of discrimination. It's come out in the research recently about sexual harassment. Why don't people raise concerns? Either because they don't think it's effective, certainly not effective in a timely way, and because it may make things worse. And people, we all do, we make these calculations about, is it worth my while? Do I just keep my head down or move somewhere else? And I put a quote there from the National Guardian's office, which is last year's National Staff Survey summary. Growing feeling that speaking up in the NHS is futile, that nothing changes as a result. They fear experiencing negative consequences if they do. And as the House of Commons Health Select Committee put 2008, so what's that, 16 years ago, whistleblowing is only necessary because of the absence of systems and culture in which all staff positively welcome internal reporting of concerns. In other words, really, we want people to be able to report them informally in the moment rather than having some formal structure for doing so, and I'll return to that in a moment. Have any of you read a report called Surviving in Scrubs? You've got a lot of reading to do. My wife's a senior manager, so I know you never have time to read, but actually it's worth reading some of this stuff, even if you really read the summaries. Because what it showed conclusively was both the scale of sexual harassment and the impact on people, and inevitably the impact on whether or not people felt able to raise concerns, challenge their seniors, challenge their colleagues, admit mistakes, with clear consequences for patient care and their own care, and because very few of them raise concerns. And similarly, in our recent report, Too Hot to Handle, anybody read Too Hot to Handle? Chief People Officers read it. It's again not a free download, but what we found, drawing both on our own research, other research, and a significantly large survey, was very similar findings to those of Robert Francis in 2015 in his Speaking Up report, where in Appendix D2, he showed that where BME staff raised concerns, they were less likely to be listened to and more likely to suffer adverse consequences if they did so. Significant numbers, significant difference. And we found similar things when we looked in our recent research, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So if we have a situation where the data on bullying has hardly moved in recent years, in fact, it's got worse, if anything, where the data on race has hardly changed. If I just give you one number. So Workforce Race Equality Standard Indicator 2, in 2016, it was 1.56 times more likely that a white person from interview will be appointed compared to someone from a black and minority ethnic background. 8 years later, it's 1.59, basically the same. Actually, it's worse, because if you take into account the influx of internationally trained staff, it should have got better, and it hasn't. And what 1.59 means, sometimes people get their calculators out when I say this, is it is 20 times more likely that a band 5 white nurse or AHP, for example, will reach band 9 compared to a black and minority ethnic band 5 entry. 20 times. If you get your calculator out, it's 1.59 times itself several times. So this is it's a major problem, and it's a good example of how small differences cumulatively have a big impact, and we'll come back to that as well. So the pace of change, why is it so? Number one, because we see EDI as compliance, not improvement. It should be a little bit about compliance, but it primarily has to be about improvement. This is part of making the organization better. And you are doing some things, by the way, I think that will help to make it better. Secondly, particularly about race, but also to some degree other protected characteristics, we hesitate to have honest conversations with people of a different protected characteristic, particularly if seniority is a factor. It is not uncommon for even very senior white managers to be really anxious about having conversations either about race or with black and minority ethnic staff. That is spotted by the person that they are trying to have the conversation with, whether it's in appraisals, feedback from interviews, whether or not where something might have gone wrong, and the person they're talking with shuts down and thinks this person's not being authentic. Conversation is a car crash. By the way, we did some research on this. We think it's the biggest single reason why black and minority ethnic staff enter the disciplinary process, because rather than me having the difficult conversation, I'll get somebody else to have that difficult conversation with the black person who we think has done something wrong. And the third reason, protective hesitancy is the technical phrase for that. And the third reason is a flawed methodology, which I will talk about in a moment. But we rely heavily in the health service on policies, procedures, and training. I'm sure you've got books of them, which are supposed to give an assurance that managers will do the right thing and know what to do, and that individual staff are able to safely and effectively raise concerns if something happens that's unfair or discriminatory. So I'll stand up while I ask this question. So put your hand up if you have ever seen the following. Somebody is appointed, somebody else raises a concern that the process wasn't fair, the appointment is stopped, it's then re-advertised, the person who raised the concern gets the job and are then thanked by their employer for having raised their concern in the first place. Who's seen that? You're no different to anywhere else. I've asked this probably of several thousand people, and nobody has ever put a hand, but that's the methodology. we rely on. It's supposed to be safe and effective for individuals to raise concerns, and it gives an assurance that managers will do the right thing. So there's a problem with the methodology, which I will kind of come to in a moment. And when we see the data not moving, we don't ask the question we would ask of, if I was the chief nurse and I came into the board and said, we've got an outbreak of MRSA, this is what we're going to do, I would be ready to deal with the question that said, why do you think that's the best thing to do? Why do you think that's the most effective thing to do? But on the whole, the NHS nationally has failed to provide people with the evidence base around most of these things. We don't tend to ask that question because on the whole, we've got long action plans in many organizations. If you ask people why they're going to work, people aren't sure. And I have to say, you look a bit better than some of the organizations I've looked at. So methodology is a problem. I'm going to skip that and come back to that later. So there is an evidence base, a very strong evidence base about what works. And I've tried to summarize it here. The first one is stop relying on individuals to raise concerns. It's not a substitute for debiasing processes, inserting accountability, and having leaders who are inclusive. What do I mean by that? So, a very simple example. Claudia Goldin, who won the Nobel Economics Prize this year, many years ago, did a piece of research looking at North American orchestras who looked like me. They were largely older, white men. There were very few women in these orchestras, and there were no black people at all. They were off playing jazz, brilliant jazz, somewhere else. So there was all sorts of heated conversations about how do we get more women in. There was training and so on. Didn't make much difference. And then somebody said, why don't we put a screen up so we can't see who's playing? Miraculously, more women were seen as the better clarinetists, violinists, and so on. But it still didn't make as big a difference as people wanted to make. And somebody else said, why don't we tell people to take their shoes off before they come and play? Because you can't hear the clippity-clop of people walking to where they're going to play. It made another big difference. I use that as a simple example. Changing processes is likely to be more effective than debiasing people. Not against trying to debias people, but on the whole, unconscious bias training, for example, improves cognitive understanding, but there's very little evidence that it makes significant differences to decision making. Example, Carlin and Dobbin looked at 708 American companies nearly 2 decades ago, biggest ever piece of work looking at that. They found that the least effective way of increasing the number of women and people of color, as they called them in the States, in more senior management positions, the least effective method was diversity training. It was other things that were more effective. So third thing is accountability. Those of you who have children will know children tend to behave differently if they think they're being watched. That's really what accountability is about. And it doesn't mean beating people up, but it does mean having a culture where you can challenge. Data-driven accountability is powerful. The best organizations are starting to do this around employment relations. You can identify where the problems are, where the challenges are. If there's time later, I can give some examples of how that's worked. And finally, leaders who are inclusive, who model the behaviors they expect of others, and so on. And we'll come back to that when we look at what allies should be doing. So this is all about leading up to. If you don't have a handle on this, you will neither have the confidence nor the understanding that allyship is about good intentions, but it's also about knowing what to do. Robert Francis in 2013 in his mid-staffs report wrote, and I think it still applies to a lot of things that happen in the health service, there lurks within the system a an institutional instinct which under pressure will prefer concealment, formulaic responses, the avoidance of public criticism, and an institutional culture which ascribes more weight to positive information about the service. What Mary Dixon Woods calls, we tend to go comfort seeking, not problem sensing. And we need to go problem sensing rather than comfort seeking around all these sorts of issues. Racism has been a big issue in the health service more recently. It surfaced, I think, as something that people really needed to think about because of the disproportionate impact of COVID. The recent race riots, I think, made people in the health service, white people in the health service, think, crikey, this issue has not gone away. And for your black and minority ethnic staff, it meant they had to really think about how they came to work. Would a brick go through their window? What are some of their colleagues really thinking? And so on. And employment tribunals have said what our own research has said for a number of years. Number one, discrimination is rarely admitted. You get a very defensive response. Well, it's not really, is it really? It's poor behaviors, but is it discrimination? Very little discrimination is overt. There's very little in-your-face racism or sexism. It's more subtle. It can often only come out in the data, or it comes out through little things which on their own are not necessarily sexist or racist, but the cumulative effect of microaggressions can be both great, and tribunals have now increasingly coming to the conclusion that when there's a cumulative set of things that have happened to somebody who is of different protected characteristic, at some point the onus turns to the manager to demonstrate it isn't racism rather than just for the member of staff to prove that it is. And that makes a big difference to how you do investigations, for example. So we tend to look at things individually rather than cumulatively. And we set too high a bar. We set the bar often, was there motive? Was the person a racist or a sexist, rather than what was the impact on the person? Very hard to prove there was motive unless there's a smoking gun around. So we have to, I'm going to miss this and move on to now. So what does all that mean for leaders such as us? When I say leaders, I don't just mean board members. I mean leaders at every level of the organization. And I've sort of divided it into two sorts of things. There's policy things that you need to think about doing, and there are behaviors. So if I take the policies first, so given that there's a strong evidence base that poor behaviors are bad for organizations, for staff and for patient care, and that good organizations are the sort of the precondition of being an effective improving organization. What does that mean for leaders? So in terms of policy, the first thing is we have to understand what racism is about. It's deep-rooted, it's resilient, it's born in our history, particularly from slavery. We find it very difficult to deal with. There are parallels with other forms of discrimination, but racism is the one where it's hardest to turn the dial. There are very interesting close parallels, I think, with sexual harassment and racism. So we have to be prepared to be uncomfortable and find out how to have conversations with people, how to put ourselves in people's shoes in order to be able to push the sorts of policies that we need to do. The second one, which I think you've done very well, is to set clear behavioral standards so that everybody which apply to everybody, including board members, which so everybody is clear about, and you understand them, and you hold people to account, and you work out which sorts of things you have an informal conversation about with, and which sorts of things you say, sorry, that's really serious. We're going to deal with it very seriously. So those standards and how to apply them is really important. HR processes in all organizations, I think the chief people officers are starting to review how they apply, how they are more proactive, how they become more preventative, a sort of feel like a public health approach to discrimination and bullying, rather than that waiting for individuals to raise concerns. And finally, remembering that what you do, what you don't do, what you collude in, what you walk past, will impact whether or not you can implement those sorts of policies. So top leadership need to think really clearly, including within their appraisals and so on, what are the policy priorities and behavioral priorities. You need to be proactive and preventative rather than waiting for people to raise concerns. Data-driven accountability is particularly powerful. And we need to review all our policies, most obviously within HR, but it would apply to other things, such as, under what circumstances might you refer someone to a regulator. And finally, as allies, we have to move away from primarily leaving it to those subjected to detriment to be the people who raise concerns. If you see someone who's trying to kind of get a wheelchair through a door that won't open, you don't leave it to them. You go open and help open the door. We need to do this. If we see someone who, because of a disability, is experiencing a disadvantage or being shunned or not being included, we need to find ways to step in. Ditto with sexual harassment. 78% of the NHS are female. 26% of our staff are from black and minority ethnic heritage. We have to be able to step in, and rather than leave it for them to raise those concerns, because people hesitate to raise concerns for the reasons I said earlier. We have to become more confident in, so that's part of a duty of care. Those of you who are clinicians, you know you have a duty of care to patients. We have a duty of care to each other. It's part of our shared humanity. We have to be more confident in having those difficult conversations. And we have to be willing to ourselves be humble, admit mistakes, listen with attention, and so on. What we do, the standard we set, is very much the key to the culture in the organization. And finally, I think there are 4 levels to allyship, and you're clearly not at number 1, and I suspect you're not at number 2, and you want to be at number 4. And this is a fairly schematic way of thinking about where you might be and where you want to be as an organization. The evidence base for allyship is powerful. It's not just good intentions, it's good intention people who know what to do. And we all have to make those calculations about when to intervene and how to intervene. However senior you are, you often have to think quite carefully about what you say and when you say it. But the principle is really clear. And I'm going to finish with, this is from another chief executive. I spoke at a big leadership conference in a trust in the Midlands. And the chief exec had the final word. And this is what he said. I thought it was very telling about culture. He said, I was talking a couple of weeks ago to one of our cleaners. It was a black cleaner, who said, you've got 2 sorts of people in your trust, Mr. Mitchell. You can work out which trust it was if you know who. He said, there are those when I'm mopping the floor who tiptoe round and apologize for getting in my way and quite often say, have a nice day. And there's a few people who walk across my floor, leaving their muddy footprints. And this is what he said, final words of the conference. If you're one of the second group of people, please get out of my organization now. And he got thunderous applause from your colleagues in that trust. So symbolic things by leaders, informal things, understanding that small things can make a big difference, but knowing what to do as well as being well-intentioned. That's what's at the heart of allyship. Thank you.
So I'm John Westbrook. The medical professions have arguably been the slowest to recognise the impact that these behaviours have on not only their profession, but the people working within it. More recently, the Royal College of Surgeons, through Professor Mortensen and others, have led the work around sexism in surgery and how that needs to be addressed and how other poor behaviours in surgery need to be addressed. Is there any evidence yet that we're seeing any benefits of that work? Or
So one of the interesting things about challenging poor behaviours is once you create a culture in which it's okay to challenge those behaviours, the data, of course, gets worse before it gets better. You see that with bullying, you see it with racism, and you see it with sexual harassment. So, for example, I chaired the oversight committee in University Hospitals Birmingham when they had a whole series. Some of you may recall there was a doctor who committed suicide, black doctor committed suicide, and it sparked a whole kind of load of heart searching. I remember saying to the board, if you are successful, at first it would look like things are getting worse before they get better. But there is evidence that if you do these things, and the same applies to bullying, by the way, things do improve. And there's an evidence. For example, one of the models which I really like is called the Vanderbilt model, based upon the Vanderbilt Medical School in the States, which uses a bystander model. And you can't just say we're going to have bystanders. You have to create a culture in which it's safe to be a bystander, and in which bystanders are listened to. One of the most telling things about people raising concerns, and there's one of the slides I didn't touch on covers it. What's crucial about people being able to raise concerns safely is whether or not the people to whom those concerns are raised act. First of all, they listen, and then they act in a timely and effective way, because we all make calculations about whether it's safe and effective to raise these things. So I would say that at UHB, who would say they've got a long way to go, I think people have been more confident about raising concerns since the chair in particular said, I'm not having this. In fact, she's a very calm woman. I was sort of banging the table and saying, it's got to stop. And I think that's given two things. It's given managers permission to intervene and challenge powerful people, because it's not easy, particularly in medicine. And it's given staff the confidence they will be listened to. I have to say I have little confidence in what NHS England have just proposed, the anonymous helplines, because if you're a kind of senior person, if you're the chief people officer and you've got an anonymous helpline, what do if someone's made an anonymous complaint about something? If there's lots in one place, you go, well, there's a problem down in surgery, or there's a problem in geriatrics, but otherwise, it seems to me it's a performative gesture. It's not an evidence-based one. So the answer is, there is evidence that improves. So the Vanderbilt model is, I'll pick on you since you asked the question. If I see you saying or doing something that I think is a bit out of order, if it's a one-off, I have what they call a cup of coffee with you. We have lots of bystanders. Cup of coffee, come on. Do you realize the impact of that? If you keep doing it, or it's really serious, it's escalated very quickly and becomes a serious misconduct. And I think that approach is quite good, because we all sometimes growl and say things or do things that we, under pressure, that we shouldn't do. If people keep doing it, or if it's really serious, you have to deal with it really seriously. Otherwise, kind of metaphorically put your arm around people and say, what's going on there? It kind of makes it. So there is an evidence base to some of this stuff, and certainly the methodology of focusing on debiasing, accountability, and what leaders do is pretty well evidenced by the research.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Yasmin. I work at the hospital on the trauma unit. So no one, when I walk across the corridor, thankfully, no one here would say anything derogatory to me, and I wouldn't expect that. It's 2024. So sometimes we find with our staff, is that racism a perception? And they want to raise a concern. So they come to us as managers. And then there's policies and procedures. And there's like raising grievances, and there's like 4-step models, and there's quite a lot of steps to go through to even get to that person's satisfactory outcome. That stops all of us in our tracks because there's a lot to go through to do that. And I'm not saying that I'm not going to do it because of those processes. Those processes are there for a purpose. My question is, should there, now that we've recognized that this is a thing, should there not be more actual processes that are more clear cut and easier to follow to get those outcomes that actually, this is probably the reason why we don't raise it. I'm a person of color. There's certain things that have happened. I may not have raised it because I might have thought, nah, what's the point? There's too many channels to go through. It's not going to happen. And I'm a ward manager, so I've been here for about 20 something years. But there's IENs now. There's nurses from different towns and cities that have come to Swindon that have originally come from different countries. And some of their perception raising concerns is that nothing's going to happen, or you'll go as far as this and it'll stop. We don't get an outcome. I don't know. I'm just asking, is there something happening in the background that's going to make that easier?
So, in a way, that's a question that goes to the heart of what I'm talking about. We shouldn't need a long, dragged out process in order to raise issues like that. Most issues around poor behaviours, we should be moving towards dealing with them in the moment when they happen informally. Clearly, if somebody is openly racist, racially abusive, that's not an informal issue. It should be clear. I think your behavioural standards are very clear on those sorts of things. That's potentially very serious. But those other things, deal with them quickly, try to deal with them informally, because nobody wants to go through a long, complicated grievance procedure during which trenches get dug, people become really ill. It generally makes things worse. I'm not saying people should never raise grievances. I used to be a trade union official, so because we did occasionally, but actually I've learned, as far as possible, deal things. Just a word of caution though, be a bit cautious about using mediation, because I think with things like sexual harassment and racism, if it was sexual harassment, you wouldn't expect a woman to sit in the same room as the bloke who sexually harassed them, unless they first of all put their hand up and said, I'm really, really sorry. I acknowledge what I've done. I want to learn. If you don't put people through mediation, because that's another act of discrimination, actually. So dealing with things informally, and that goes back to my point about use the data and the lived experience and the soft intelligence to say, something is going on down in pediatrics. We're going to go and talk, find out what's going on there, and try to understand, what's going on here. Is it because of pressure of work? Is it because of other things? Because most discrimination is covert. It's not overt. And therefore it's harder to deal with. It's easier to deny. We tend to often express as much sympathy to the person who's accused of racism as the person who's raising the concern. Or we do useless things like, I'll pick on your front. Yeah, that's terrible what you've told me. I'll go and have a quiet word with them. No, there has to be learning, and there has to be not humiliation, but there has to be open learning from it. So I think that goes to the heart of what I'm trying to say. The prime responsibility is for the more senior you are to take responsibility to understand your own power. Senior people, are often seen as very scary, but we do have clout, and we need to take responsibility for going out and looking for it, that kind of problem sensing. When it happens, we should ideally deal with it informally without the need for a procedure, but that's not an argument against having procedures where it's clear that's the only way forward.
So we know we've got a big problem with career progression, particularly for Band 6 and above BME staff. And I'm really minded that in a few years, the majority of our resident medics will be international medical graduates. I think I'm right in saying that. Angus, tell me if I've got that wrong. And so I'm wondering, what are the evidence-based interventions that ensure equity in career progression? So what are the things that, because you've told us that doing unconscious bias training isn't enough. So what are the key things that are evidence-based to make a difference in that career progression?
The first thing is to acknowledge, in the way that Yinka explained, bias is ubiquitous. It pops up everywhere. It pops up at every stage of the sort of cycle of career progression. And there's loads and loads of, in fact, those of you who are kind of masochists can go off and read a thing I wrote called No More Tick Boxes, which is 160 pages long with 40 pages of references, because I was really challenging the whole way in which career progression is approached, not just on race, but on disability and gender too. So how jobs are described, how many the NHS drives people towards having these ridiculously long essential criteria. Lots of research. If you have loads and loads of essential criteria, it doesn't put off people like me, because I'm quite happy to apply for jobs where I can't do it all. But if you think you might be held to a higher standard, i.e. you're a woman, or you're from a black and minority background, you're going to be more reluctant. You're going to think, I'm not sure about that. What will happen if I kind of don't know it all? So at the point at which you describe the job, the way in which shortlisting is done, Google work on the basis. There's a really good book called What Works by the former HR director at Google, who says we should assume that all those people, we shouldn't be shortlisting people who don't think can do the job. But if that's the case, what we're really interested in is not their technical skills, but the extent to which they are willing to speak truth to power and able to demonstrate they can work collaboratively with other people. They're the two most important things within teams. But if you focus on all these other skills, it's really easy for some people who've had more advantages of stretch opportunities, for example, to demonstrate they've done more things, they've done better things, they've had the opportunity to showcase themselves, to develop their confidence on. So shortlisting and the access to stretch opportunities is a key area where bias comes in. I mean, I don't know how it works here, but in many organizations, most stretch opportunities are allocated through the tap on the shoulder. And that's something that you should stop. It should be done. It should be monitored. Access should be monitored. And you should have clear policies that ensure, which I'll perhaps just on a moment, that there's more or less equal access, particularly for disadvantaged groups. People often focus on the interview process being unfair. So we do things like we'll make more diverse panels. Actually, the evidence base for more diverse panels is not very strong, either for gender or for race. I'm not against them. I'm in favour of them. But they're not going to decisively change things. The key advantages that people have don't surface in the interview. It's what happens beforehand. It's the encouragement. It's the opportunities. It's the support. The kind of assumptions that people have made about people within in the build-up to the interview. Within the interview, there's a risk of all sorts of biases creeping in. So, for example, another thing that Google do, may upset one or two of you, but it's meant in a nice way, is that the future line manager is involved in the shortlisting, but does not have a vote on the appointment. Now, I think most line managers, when they first think, I'm not doing that, I'm going to manage this person. But actually, there's examples first of all, in the health service, there's a number of examples, I've written about it, where that's happened, generally accidentally, it's almost eliminated affinity bias, where you think, I'll pick on you because you're near me. you do the same sports, you went to the same school, you've got the same interests, got the same colour scheme, whatever it might be, you tend to appoint people like you or that you think will fit in. If you stop that to a significant degree by saying, actually, let's think carefully about how powerful the manager is. There's all sorts of other things. When you do the scoring at the end of a long day, when you're tired at the end of a long day, you're worried about collecting the kids from school or whatever, at the end of an interview, it's a brilliant opportunity for bias to creep in. Bias creeps in under pressure when you're in a hurry, because you revert to the things that you don't really think about. And then finally, there's the onboarding. So at each stage, you can show that. So if I just give one example, is Yinka still here? So Yinka will know because she used to work there. Imperial, I don't know if you talked about this because I missed the first 5 minutes of your... So Imperial Trust, the HR director kind of heard something I said and they decided to implement it. They do two particular things. If you, when you're appointing, if you don't appoint people who are good enough to be shortlisted from underrepresented groups, before you can get the appointment approved, you have to explain why that's the best person, and you have to say what the organisation is going to do to make sure that next time people that were good enough to be shortlisted are more likely to be appointed. And then the chief exec, are you the chief exec? That's a duck and a dive. The chief exec, you have to write a letter to the chief exec. It's called a Dear Tim letter because that's his first name. And what he does is randomly, this is based on something I talked about from the American Marines, randomly would ring up senior managers and say, I'll pick on you because you're near me, hi, just looked at your data. We're not really appointing as many women or BME staff as we should be. So it's not a beat you up conversation, but it is a challenge. Why do you think that's happening? What can we do to help you? So, of course, the first thing you do at the end of that phone call is ring up all your mates and say, do you know what? Bloody chief exec's on the phone. You know what he wants to know? Why I've appointed people. So everybody becomes a bit more aware that they're accountable. So it's a nudge as much as a beat you up. What you don't want is 2 phone calls from the chief exec, because that's a problem. So those sorts of soft accountabilities work, particularly when they're part of a cumulative approach. And if you're an ally, you have to think about how can I do this in a way that carries, as far as possible, carries people with me, but is authentic. So I'm prepared to stand up for these things as and when I need to, because some of these things you're going to get challenged about. But it's that kind of example of good intention plus knowing what to do, because we all do. I've just finished, perhaps, with an example from Barack Obama's cabinet. He appointed a cabinet. Do you want to ask a question for? Right. He appointed a cabinet, had quite a lot of women in. But what he was doing during the opening cabinet meetings, without him realizing, he was tending to call men to speak. So 3 of the women decided to do the following. So Susan would say something, and Tracy would say, I agree with Susan. And then Wendy would say, I agree with Tracy. And after a couple of meetings where this kept happening on 2 or 3 items, Obama called them in and said, look, something going on, I'm missing something. And they said, well, what you're doing is, you're not calling us. When you do call us, the blokes are looking at their mobile phones. And when the minutes are written up, we're not properly represented in them. So at the next meeting, he said, I think this was being an ally, this is what's been happening. It's going to stop. I'm going to stop doing it. If I hear of any of you doing it, it's a serious problem. That's what allies do.
Hi, thank you very much, Roger. I think your presentation was very, very insightful. And I'd also like to say thank you to Sharon. I don't think I might have the opportunity again for putting on the day. I am a Black woman in an organization that is predominantly white. Um, and some of the things that you said has really hit home in terms of my experience as a Black woman in an organization like I have described. You have spoken quite extensively on allyship and the importance of allyship, how it represents the organization. I, as a Black woman, would love for my senior managers in my organization and my colleagues to be allies to myself and some of my other colleagues. You've spoken a lot about it's not what you say, but it's about what you do and why you do it. Okay. Now, if I'm sitting in this room as a senior manager, a senior exec in this room, and I have heard all of the impact that you have described when you have a good speak up culture in an organization, when people are supported, minorities are supported to be able to speak up, to be able to feel free, to contribute to the organization and to feel respected. What I would like to know is if I leave this room after hearing what I've heard today, what should be my next step as a leader, as a manager in the room? And then conversely, as a person of color in this organization, what should be my next step after hearing what you have said? What should I do as a person to support what you have said today?
So to take those in order, I think it will be really good. So I'm assuming that, like every other organization are going to, we have colleagues who are 100% convinced of what the sorts of things I'm talking about, and other colleagues who aren't sure. I'd be very surprised if there isn't that kind of range. But what the first thing that there's two things, I'm going to cheat slightly, there's two things that everybody needs to do. Be prepared and think about how to become uncomfortable about some of the things that I've been talking about, particularly on race. Because if you're not able to have those conversations, it's all very well doing all the other things I've talked about. You won't do them with conviction and authenticity, and that will be spotted. You have to know that this is worth doing. It's important to do, and that when people, when 26% of the staff in the NHS are from Black and minority backgrounds, and 78% of staff are female. These are not side issues; these are central issues. So, being uncomfortable, particularly about race, I think is crucial. People are terrified of saying the wrong thing. Stop it. Be prepared to kind of think through, practice, talk to colleagues. Be prepared to get it wrong sometimes. It's fine as long as you're not being deliberately offensive. Just think about how you get to grips with this kind of issue. And link to that is then being excuse me, proactive and preventative, not waiting for people on your team, in your division, on your site, in your profession to raise concerns, but go out looking for them. Being proactive. They're the two key things I think that all managers need to do. And as far as colleagues from a Black and minority background are concerned, I think what I'm hesitate to say what you should do, because I think primarily it's our problem. But I think you need to find ways and talk with the organization about whether or not the things that are being done are working in a context where people are listening to you. So, for example, my experience, people very, very rarely raise issues of race discrimination unless they're actually at the end of their tether. most of the time people keep quiet about it because they're worried about the consequences of raising it. It's going to make things worse. So you need to, with colleagues, collectively as well as individually, find ways to have voice within the organization. And then it's for the very senior leaders to make sure they hear and listen and act on what you're saying. And what you're saying should complement what they are finding out in terms of what the data and the lived experience shows. So it's a bit of a short answer to a potentially long one. But those things, if you do those things, it will make a difference. If you don't, then allyship is just talking.
Thank you, Roger, very much indeed. We'd like to thank you very much indeed.